Ladies and gentlemen, a very good warm morning to you from Singapore. Thank you for joining us for the final session of our 36th ASEAN Roundtable, Braving the Storms, ASEAN in Crisis Mode. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items to take note of. For technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. To ask questions of the speakers, please use the Q&A function, stating your name and affiliation together with your question. Thank you for your cooperation. Today's session, titled Regional, Political and Security Landscape, will be divided into two panels. I now have the pleasure of inviting the moderator and panelists for the first panel, titled The Myanmar Challenge to ASEAN Unity and Centrality. Moderating this panel will be Dr. Michael Montesano, Visiting Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Myanmar Studies Program at ICE's Yusof Ishak Institute. Joining him on the panel are Dr. Michael Vatikiotis and Mr. Min Zin. I'll now turn over the time to the moderator. Dr. Montesano, please.
Many thanks, Nadine, and welcome listeners to this morning's panel on the Myanmar Challenge to ASEAN Unity and Centrality. We have two distinguished speakers to share their thoughts with us today. The first is Dr. Michael Vatikiotis, the Asia Regional Director at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. He will speak on ASEAN and the thorny Myanmar program. I would be remiss in introducing Dr. Vatikiotis without sharing my congratulations to him on his recent book, Lives Between the Lines, A Journey in Search of the Lost Levant. Our second speaker on this morning's panel is an extremely influential and sharp interpreter of ongoing events in Myanmar, the executive director of the Institute for Strategy and Policy, Myanmar, Mr. Min Zin. His talk will be entitled Myanmar Disillusioned. I'll now pass the floor to Dr. Vatikiotis, who will speak for 15 minutes. He will be followed directly by Mr. Min Zin, who will also speak for 15 minutes. We will then have 30 full minutes for questions and answers. Michael?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for your very generous introduction. I sometimes feel that actually I've long been in a journey in search of ASEAN. So with regard to the matter at hand regarding ASEAN and Myanmar, there's been a lot of criticism of the failure by ASEAN to address the fallout from the 1st of February coup in Myanmar. And I think it also has to be seen in the context of ASEAN's struggle to retain regional security centrality in the face of increasing superpower rivalry between the US and China. These two challenges to ASEAN's role, relevance, and centrality have basically hit at the same time. The consequences will come into sharp focus in late October at a summit of ASEAN leaders, followed, of course, by a broader meeting of regional leaders known as the East Asia Summit. Now, when the leaders of Australia, China, India, Japan, Russia, and the United States join their ASEAN colleagues in this event, the presence of the Myanmar military leadership and questions around the efficacy of ASEAN diplomatic efforts to reverse the coup will be a source of friction. From an ASEAN standpoint, also, the weaving of new alliances aimed at China, about which most member states were barely consulted, will also create an awkward set of meetings, and I think complicate the Myanmar issue. A further complication, of course, will be the fact that these meetings will be held online. The situation triggered by the Myanmar coup in February underscores a time of great weakness and vulnerability for ASEAN, therefore. At the political level, the region's leaders are all either in transition, weak and unpopular, or apathetic. Singapore is undergoing a leadership transition that's being complicated and drawn out by the COVID-19 pandemic. Malaysia has a weak transitional government that's been unable to establish a strong parliamentary majority. Thailand's prime minister was almost unseated by an internal revolt at a recent parliamentary no-confidence debate. And Indonesia's President, Joko Widodo, is famously uninterested in foreign affairs, while Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte is in his last year of office. And while there is strong and durable leadership in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Brunei, these countries are keeping a low profile and focusing on domestic affairs. I think this political context, particularly at the leadership level, is also an inhibitive factor when it comes to dealing with Myanmar. This means, because of this, this means there is simply little will and very poor levels of interaction between ASEAN leaders to address regional problems, and very poor interaction among their officials since they're only meeting online, virtually. Recent ASEAN meetings have been conducted either virtually or as limited hybrid affairs due to the pandemic, which hasn't helped to improve the quality and substance of regional diplomacy. The last in-person leaders meeting was at the end of April. The coming summit will, I'm told, be virtual. This is an extremely poor environment for assertive regional diplomacy and decision-making. Not surprisingly, ASEAN efforts to implement a 5-point consensus on Myanmar agreed in April with the junta leader at a special emergency summit in Jakarta have gone nowhere. A special envoy, Dato' Irian Yusof, the junior foreign minister of Brunei, which holds the current chairmanship of ASEAN, was only appointed in July. And he was seen as a compromise after Thailand and Indonesia failed to secure support for their stronger candidates. Working together, Indonesia and Thailand might have had more leverage over the Myanmar military government. Since then, the special envoy's efforts to gain access to opposition figures in Myanmar and to secure the junta's cooperation for a humanitarian pause have been ineffectual. After an ASEAN foreign ministers meeting on October the 4th, where it was clear that Myanmar had no intention of supporting more effective political engagement, some countries have mulled the idea of disinviting Myanmar to the ASEAN summit in October. This, I think, seems unlikely. The authorities in Myanmar are now offering meetings with less important political figures, and some moderate voices within the military-led government are trying to build bridges to the international community. But the fact is that General Min Aung Hlaing has never accepted the imposition of the 5-point consensus reached at the end of April. As much as all this has frustrated some diplomats and analysts in the region and beyond, this is just fine for some smaller ASEAN member states. They fear more effective regional action intervening in domestic political matters and deciding on strategic direction. Brunei's steering of the Myanmar diplomacy, for example, maintains a useful check on the more assertive role of larger states like Indonesia. For larger ASEAN member states, the current situation is deeply frustrating. Indonesia has made no secret of its dissatisfaction with the lack of progress on a coordinated regional approach to Myanmar. I think people underestimate the extent to which, and always have underestimated, the extent to which Indonesian foreign policy, especially since the transition to democracy in 1998, has been rather idealistic. The net result is a damaging disunity and growing public anger over the group's inaction and failure to address escalating violence and human rights abuses in Myanmar. Young activists in the region have warned that the lack of firm action against the coup leaders will force them to look for alternatives in building a Southeast Asian community. The so-called Milk Tea Alliance of youthful protesters against authoritarian rule has drawn together supporters from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thailand, and Myanmar using social media platforms. And these have pressed ASEAN to reach out to opposition forces in Myanmar. Meanwhile, the context in which the 5-point consensus was framed is changing. Levels of armed resistance in Myanmar are steadily increasing, and the extent to which the Tatmadaw, the army, controls the country may soon be called into question. Already, large parts of Chin State, Karen, and Mon State may be considered in opposition hands. Rakhine State has essentially been ceded to the Arakan army. The Tatmadaw will be forced to conduct more invasive clearance operations, which will highlight the extent of violence and increase the number of civilian casualties. All of this starts to put pressure on ASEAN member states to distance themselves from the Tatmadaw and engage with the national unity government more seriously. Frontline states like Thailand will be particularly uncomfortable about this reality. ASEAN as a whole will be faced with the kind of credential challenge it last confronted after the civil war in Cambodia. This will generate more divisive fissures in the region. Is there a way forward? The 5-point consensus was a bold plan to attempt a political and humanitarian intervention in Myanmar. Its logic was sound, but the wider implications were scary, turning ASEAN into something more than its membership is ready to accept. One major impediment is ASEAN's failure to strengthen the Secretariat and the role of the ASEAN Secretary General. The Charter provides for this, in particular, the Secretary General's role in offering mediation and good officers support. But member states won't allow it because of the threat this kind of activism presents to sovereignty and sustaining the organization's convenient weakness. A good example is how poorly equipped the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center is to play this role in spearheading humanitarian aid and assistance to Myanmar. There are those who argue that the AHA Center should be strictly confined to servicing natural disasters, since the political dimension of the Myanmar crisis complicates decision-making and politicizes humanitarian efforts. I should say that ASEAN is not alone in facing the challenges of discreet, quiet diplomacy through the use of envoys. It's becoming a global problem, particularly with the role of social media and the publicity that's given to such diplomacy that makes it very, very difficult for envoys and diplomats to operate quietly. In sum, whilst the hard sovereignty and non-interference dogma may have been protected by Myanmar's refusal to submit to the 5-point consensus, the longer-term impact will be detrimental for ASEAN. It's clear that the coup in Myanmar has the potential to develop into a regional humanitarian crisis, as increasing food insecurity, poor public health, and rising levels of violence drive people to the country's borders to seek refuge or to escape. Sadly, with weak leadership, chronic institutional weakness, and the increasing geostrategic polarity in the region, the chances of reinforcing ASEAN's relevance and role look slim for the time being, particularly as the pandemic continues to affect the region. Perhaps ASEAN needs a special envoy to itself. Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
Many thanks, Michael. Given us a lot to chew on. Before we open the floor to questions, however, I turn the floor over now to Mr. Min Zin, speaking from Chiang Mai, who will discuss Myanmar disillusioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Let me start with the 3 different intervention approach from the international community after the military coup in February. The first approach we can say is basically the conflict in Myanmar, basically the conflict parties in Myanmar, they are still locking themselves in a position which they can only conceive violent resolution of conflict is the only way, the only acceptable way. So it is very difficult for the external players to intervene in Myanmar affair. So let the Myanmar conflict burn out itself and get exhausted. We need to wait for a time. So that's like one typical position that we can even hear from the former diplomat like Bilahari, like the writing. The second approach is mainly to do with, if the situation is getting out of control, why don't we do like limited intervention? this approach is adopted by the neighboring countries such as Thailand, China, and India. So to push back any spillover effect inside Myanmar, try to contain any possible humanitarian catastrophe within the Myanmar boundaries. So this is a second approach. The third approach is, well, this is too complicated issue, so just leave it to other. So the best candidate is ASEAN. So ASEAN centrality is the best way to for the many Western countries to hide behind. So that's a three broad approach that the international community has pursued since February. But the question is, what is ASEAN Way and ASEAN centralities and leverages? ASEAN Way is somehow that non-interference and consensus building, which is kind of like paradoxically undermines its own ASEAN centrality as ASEAN as a facilitators to address Myanmar crisis. And then especially the ASEAN Special Envoy Office, it has like lacking two critical leverages. One is, I call it like credibility leverage. The second one is more like capability leverage. In terms of credibility leverage, again, we can see credibility leverage as a function of trust and cooperation, which is problematic from the get-go, from the beginning. I mean, historically, Myanmar people are suspicious of the ASEAN constructive engagement throughout 1990s all the way to 2010, except one small episode of Nagin cyclone period. That at that time, Myanmar appreciated ASEAN effort to support Myanmar people. But in the context of deepening grievances right now, the ASEAN constructive engagement has been like reactivated in their memory. So they really entertain the distrust against ASEAN mediation effort. Second is in June, especially the visit by the ASEAN Secretary General and then the current Special Envoy to Naypyidaw, and then their statement, which they addressed the Commander-in-Chief of the Myanmar military as the chairman of the State Administrative Council, so which is more official title that ASEAN tried to avoid, which statement was later on removed from the ASEAN website. That's also signal to the Myanmar actors. I mean, the situation is not very, in favor of people who have been oppressed by the military. Instead of that, the ASEAN is taking side with the military. The third is in August, ASEAN was under fire again for inviting Myanmar military representative as an observer to the ASEAN Parliamentary Assembly. That's also another big blow, and then the people of Myanmar are quite disappointed. And that the military junta has managed to get the best, to take advantage of ASEAN's weak internal coherence too. That they are very good at, military is very good at to play one against another, in 90s and 2000s. They are doing the same playbook again. And on part of the opposition movement, such as NUG, I mean, you can see like in September, only 2 days after ASEAN Special Envoy called for the humanitarian ceasefires in Myanmar, the NUG declared its defensive war against junta. So that's, you can see lack of trust and lack of cooperation on part of the key stakeholders in Myanmar with regard to ASEAN mediation. So the second element is more capability leverage, which I must say as a function of enforcement with tangible and economic and material power, which we know ASEAN lacks in this regard. Especially ASEAN non-interference and consensus seem to be institutional constraint. That's what we can say it's a given. So which demonstrated not only in Myanmar case, right, as an internal affair of the member state, but also in the group's relevancy in broader regional superpower rivalries. So then what's next? The first thing is, despite its ineffectiveness, I think many countries in ASEAN, especially the neighboring country, such as Thailand and beyond, like China and India, will be fine with the, to still hang on to ASEAN mechanism. And of course, they will not go against, making occasional official condemnation, against the military, but their main concern is humanitarian catastrophe that will have a spillover effect, to their country. So that for them, even though in effectiveness, ASEAN mechanism is still okay for them. And then another group of countries like Indonesia or Malaysia, to some extent Singapore, and many Western countries will adopt more knee-jerk default reactions. That could lead to more sanction, deeper punishment, but from afar, without having much strategic direction and end game plan. Because nobody wants to fix Myanmar, which is quite complicated and having intractable conflict for many years. So that's not very good or sensible or prudence for the foreign policy maker to fix Myanmar. So that's even though when we see in effectiveness of ASEAN initiative, that's the most possible two-part way we can expect out of this failure. Then another people they might have more optimistic view, so they expect the new ASEAN chair like Cambodia will be coming in next year. Then Cambodia can come up with a more fresh, start, clean slate, build trust, reframe the conflict, expand the pool of the trade-off issues, and to encourage both sides. All these good things, but it seems to be too good to be true. Especially people in Myanmar are quite worried about Cambodia being proxy of Chinese. So that's another thing we cannot underestimate the role of China, in Myanmar, and the some of the ASEAN members being so close to China, and that's what they are worried too. And then another possible positive outcome is if ASEAN initiative break down, probably it could force international community, even though they don't want to do it, but it could force their laissez-faire approach. Okay, it doesn't work. At least in terms of public face, we need to do something. So they are probably being forced to do something. But to me, I think it's so important to remind Myanmar crisis should not be viewed as a snapshot. It's a very long contextualized process. If we don't see it, I think we will be in big trouble, disappointed with our own effort. So the coup and its aftermath is not just between the military and pro-democracy movement. It's the latest evidence of incomplete nation building in Myanmar, which has been for more than 7 decades. So that's why we should not entertain any naive or hope that any mediation can have a magic power to make the sudden breakthrough in short term. So we need to recognize that complex and intractable nature of Myanmar conflict, and then we need to manage our expectation. So basically it means we need to be very clear with our strategic objective. What do we want out of this? Otherwise, we will be stuck in more idealistic journey. So it's a second chance possible for ASEAN. I think it's a very limited, leverages, as I already outlined. But there are a few things that ASEAN can do if we are quite, prudent. 2 steps ASEAN can take place, can take place. The first one is ASEAN really need to review its current strategy. I think the idea of 5-point consensus is good, but this is basically political package. It doesn't have the element of trust, elements of cooperation, elements of relationship. So I think it's important to introduce new strategic assessment and analysis on Myanmar crisis. Second thing is, I think it's important to undertake ASEAN to play a role of effective convener, to coordinate among all these different international actors. Especially, I think ASEAN should mitigate that harm effect of this, so-called spaghetti bowl, phenomena, ASEAN noodle bowl. Basically, you have so many special envoys. You have so many overlapping, crisscrossing, envoys, who are doing for their own different interests. Now you have Chinese special envoy, Japanese special envoy, UN special envoy, and the US special envoy is coming soon. So I think it's a job of ASEAN Special Envoy Office to coordinate. Otherwise, Burmese military is very good at to play one against another. So I think it's important for the ASEAN Special Envoy to coordinate and to different envoys to exercise their different strengths so that they can change the calculus of cost and bargaining by the both Myanmar junta as well as its opposition. And it's not that easy to me, but we really need to focus on how to build all possible leverages within that given structural constraints. So that we can, what the Teddy Roosevelt would say, like speak softly, but you can carry at least a big stick. So other than that, I don't see ASEAN can play an effective role in mediating a resolution in Myanmar. Before I conclude, I think I should be quite careful. I think in politics, especially in Myanmar politics, which is quite protracted and intractable, we should often guard against the chasing of the closure. I think in many of us, we have a tendency, as reading a book, okay, we read this chapter, then move on. I think in Myanmar conflict, I think the chasing of the closure is not pragmatic. Now we need to be safer. It's always safer to lower our arch for closure. Otherwise, we tend to interpret information just to suit our conclusion. Even though if we cannot find solution or closure here, but I think we can still get a good explanation to make sense of the Myanmar crisis and the role of ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine, and good morning, everyone, and good evening, actually, to our two speakers who are based in Colorado and Delaware, respectively. We already had our work cut out for us with the question left over from the previous panel. Just to give a quick introduction, title of this panel is ASEAN Standing in the Regional Order. I think I have a bit of an argument with the verb standing. Maybe the speakers who want to weigh in on that. I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Alice and See Seng need no introduction, because if you've been in the ASEAN field, ASEAN multilateral structures, and ASEAN among the great powers, they've published extensively, and I do not need to give any further introduction to the two speakers. But I want to encourage us to the speakers to stick to the time limit. 15 minutes, if not shorter, hopefully, so that we can, I'm sure we have a deluge of questions coming through the chat with the Q&A box. So appreciate your time discipline. If not, the curtains will come down on you quite close to 15 minutes. So without further ado, we'll have Professor Alice Ba to present her thoughts on ensuring ASEAN survival in a changing multilateral world. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you very much, William. So first, let me thank also the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for inviting me to this roundtable. So as William said, we've been asked to keep our remarks relatively brief, and so I'm going to try to do that. On this topic of ASEAN's survival in the changing multilateral world, I'm going to focus my initial remarks on just 2 points, not 3, but 2. What is the nature of the challenge for ASEAN? And 2, what are some of the ways to think about ASEAN's paths forward given today's development? On the first, I do think it's useful to start by clarifying what the perceived challenge is understood to be for ASEAN and how it relates to this challenge of contemporary multilateralism in Asia and really more broadly globally. And specifically, this challenge is understood to be the following, namely a phenomenon of new alternative frameworks, including these so-called mini-lateral efforts. We see this at the global level, and we see this also at the regional level, as represented most recently by AUKUS and the Quad in Asia. As smaller groupings, often with narrower agendas, these are not multilateralism in principle or in practice. Broadly speaking, multilateralism, or at least late 20th century multilateralism, has been premised on this principle and practice of pluralism and broad inclusion, and even universalism if we're going to talk about global governance institutions. Today's minilateralism is a reaction in no small part to the difficulties of dealing with that pluralism in existing institutions. And that includes ASEAN and ASEAN-associated frameworks in Asia. ASEAN is operated on the principles of broad engagement, right? And on the principles of a consensus. These are strategic principles. They're not just normative multilateral ones for Southeast Asian states. But of course, this gets difficult when key participants find their fundamental interests and priorities stymied in these larger groupings in which they find competing actors and competing agendas. It is especially difficult when the dissatisfied are the larger powers or increasingly more capable ones. This broader interest in minilateralism is seen to threaten ASEAN in three key ways. One, it is a threat to specific ASEAN arrangements. Two, they're seen as challenging Southeast Asian states' strategic preference for omni-engagement over competitive fragmentation, for example. Three, it is also viewed as a threat to ASEAN's positionality, or namely what we've all come to know as ASEAN centrality. So this leads me to my second point. What are some ways to think about the paths forward given these challenges? I think, needless to say, especially given the discussion of the last panel, the challenges are great, right? The last panel highlighted the particular challenge of Myanmar as a challenge to ASEAN's credibility, which also, of course, affects its standing in this larger geopolitical mix and context. In the larger Asian geopolitical context that this panel is focused on, the challenges are also great, even in and of themselves without Myanmar, right, in the mix. And they also, of course, include some of the same, I think, problems that were highlighted in the last panel, including leadership and questions about regime changes. In any case, there's also much that's beyond what ASEAN is able to do, right? So suffice it to say the challenges are great. So are there paths forward? And here, I was asked to consider some of the ways that ASEAN might, quote, reinvent itself. But I think the opportunity lies not in reinvention, but rather in reframing or rearticulation of what the goals of ASEAN centrality are, right? As a normative principle, ASEAN centrality has served ASEAN well, I would argue. It has served ASEAN well in the sense that it has given states a larger voice in agenda setting in Asia. ASEAN centrality has been additionally useful, I think, today, actually still as kind of an easy conceptual handle, right? It's become an easy conceptual handle and normative reminder about the need to pay attention to a critical Southeast Asian audience of potential supporters and potential detractors of policies and agendas pursued by others. And while other powers may have their own agendas, because they do, right? This is what they are acknowledging when they state their support for ASEAN centrality. And yes, in Southeast Asia, there's a large group of states that matter to the perceived rightness and the efficacious implementation of their policies, right? They can make it difficult, they can also make it easier. To quote what is now a commonly cited quote, actually from Kurt Campbell, right? This same quote has been quoted all over the place. But Kurt Campbell, who is of course now, the Indo-Pacific czar in the Biden administration, and of course previously served in the Obama administration, that quote, for an effective Asia strategy and an effective Indo-Pacific approach, you must do more in Southeast Asia. Quote, ASEAN centrality has become an expression of that basic idea, right? What is less useful, I would argue, is to take ASEAN centrality literally, right? Or to equate ASEAN centrality with ASEAN's position in a hierarchy of institutions, which is what I think we've been doing. Centrality gets increasingly difficult to defend, right? When there is such a mix of diverse actors and competing interests. So while the idea of centrality is useful, and again, I want to emphasize that as a conceptualization, it continues to be worth promoting for the reasons stated. It's also in important ways obscures what ASEAN is really about and what it arguably does better, right? And what ASEAN does better is to connect otherwise centrifugal fragmenting forces, right? It's what it's done in Southeast Asia, although challenged as we know. It is what it's done in broader Asia, also challenged as we know, right? But it reframes what the expectation is my point, right? And so again, connectivity is its strength. Of course, it's also its primary challenge. But it has created pathways for connectivity between these otherwise divergent and different forces. So it may be useful to rethink what the value of ASEAN centrality is, to think of ASEAN centrality less as centrality per se, and more in terms of connectivity, connecting the different parts of Asia and Southeast Asia together. Thinking about centrality through connectivity also offers a way to agenda set in more concrete ways, right? In ways that allow ASEAN to more proactively engage and shape the changing landscape, and at the same time still serve, I think, what are its most important priorities, which are regional resilience and maintaining constructive relations with all the players, right? And all of these, of course, serve ultimately what is the most important interest of all, which is the strategic autonomy of states. It may be worth citing, as kind of my last few points here, it may be worth citing some different ways that ASEAN has or could connect otherwise fragmenting forces, right? I think the key example is actually RCEP, right? RCEP itself, I think, came out of a context of multiple FTAs, right? Fragmenting, competing, right? This is how we characterize them. RCEP offers a common integrating framework, and it does appear that the momentum is here to move towards ratification, right? So, RCEP is a good example of again, how ASEAN has kind of brought together different strains, as well as the ways in which ASEAN +1 arrangements can serve a broader integrative agenda. There are unrealized opportunities, and I'll conclude with the unrealized ones, right? At least 3, I think, come to mind. I think 1 is the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Yes, there's a range of views in Southeast Asia about the different dimensions of the Indo-Pacific. But I think what the AOIP tries to offer is, first of all, as others have highlighted, a more principled multilateral alternative for one thing, to the ideas and practices that are more fragmenting. But it also offers a practical opportunity to focus on real tangibles, right? Functional economic cooperation, functional needs in the maritime domain, including maritime connectivity. These are also become paths by which to, again, maintain states' general preference for omni-engagement in service of ASEAN's agendas. But more can be done here, right? Again, I think it's unrealized. Other examples are MPAC, and I think also the Mekong, right? In the case of the Mekong, also multiple frameworks, right? Heightened competition seems to be also playing out now. And of course, there's also the larger issue of competing gravitational forces in mainland Southeast Asia versus those in maritime Southeast Asia. But in the Mekong, ASEAN itself as an integrative framework, I think has been less prominent. And so here too, I think that there's a better role to play, or a more heightened role to play on the part of ASEAN. In short, the main point here is that there's an opportunity to be more proactive as opposed to defensive, right? As one way to do that is to rethink or be clearer about what the value of ASEAN centrality is and what it can do, right? Rather than, again, being defensive in defending what is an institutional status quo, okay? Centrality as connectivity offers a way to also focus on more tangible outcomes that I think are also more realistic in terms of what we might expect ASEAN to do, right? So I'm going to end it at that, and I look forward to the larger discussion.
Thanks a lot, Alice. I think that was a great point about the difference between centrality and connectivity and how ASEAN can be more proactive rather than defensive. Now I'll open the floor to See Seng. Thank you, See Seng.
Well, thank you. Thank you, William, and my thanks to the organizers for including me in this discussion. It's probably not appropriate, but perfectly understandable, especially at this venue, to confess that following ASEAN has got to be one of the most frustrating things I've done in my 20 years as an academic, but it is what it is, right? Let me invoke Bilahari Kausikan, who's already been invoked once today. And he reminded us some time ago that when it comes to ASEAN, we cannot really expect a cow to be a horse, even if that cow pretends at times to be a horse. And I think that's a useful reminder as ASEAN continues to persist in its existential crisis, whether it's inability or unwillingness to affect the situation in Myanmar, as we have heard very well in the panel earlier, or the perennial question of its being able to survive, let alone overcome the intense pressures that are being placed upon it by the US-China rivalry. Let me try to make three very broad observations to the question that I've been asked to address on ASEAN's strategic positioning in US-China relations. Firstly, let me state the obvious. The US-China rivalry will likely persist rather than abate. And I think there were initial hopes, probably misplaced, that a Biden administration may walk back on Mr. Trump's hardline policy against China. But my sense is that the only walking back so far has been a lessening, perhaps, in the histrionics, less of the brinksmanship, less of the machismo that marked Mr. Trump's America First approach. And fairly or otherwise, I think there is a perception that the US, thanks to the Trump administration, by very petulantly walking away from the playground, as it were, effectively ceded the ground to China. And Mr. Biden came to the presidency determined that the US needed to get tough with China. Those were his exact words. And as the very tense high-level meetings, both in Anchorage back in March and in Tianjin in July, both suggest that there is no guarantee that Mr. Biden will improve bilateral relations with Beijing. And I think it is fair to expect that the US-China relationship will remain rocky, with Southeast Asia as the ground zero, as it were. I do not rule out the possibility that in the short run, US-China competition could in fact benefit the ASEAN region economically in trade and investment terms. And it's fair to say that we did see a little bit of that, although it was probably very much less salubrious maybe for open economies like Singapore. And to be courted, to be wooed by two powerful suitors is fun when both suitors play according to a set of rules, when their conduct is governed informally by a kind of grand bargain, if you will, not to overstep each other's bounds and to give ASEAN space to breathe. But it is not as fun when those suitors expect and demand returns on investments in terms of one's loyalties, when they insist that ASEAN must choose one over the other. And this leads me to my second broad observation, that in response to the US-China rivalry, my sense is that ASEAN, and in varying degrees, the member states as well, will continue to seek and to maintain strategic autonomy, or at least some semblance of it, as best they could. The ASEAN states, and indeed ASEAN as an organization, have sought for the most part to avoid full alignment with either the US or China, so as to carve out strategic space and diplomatic flexibility for themselves, not always successfully, to be sure. But, you know, we've heard a lot about Cambodia in the earlier panel, but I think even in the case of Cambodia, seemingly the most sold out to China amongst the ASEAN states, I think there is growing debate within the foreign policy establishment in Phnom Penh over the wisdom of over-reliance on China. Where that leads to is an open question, obviously. So hedging remains the preferred strategy, I think, amongst Southeast Asians, and nowhere is this more evident than in the way ASEAN has responded to the China-led BRI, and as well as to the US-led free and open Indo-Pacific notion. Alice has already mentioned the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and I think that outlook document is a prime example of what I'm trying to suggest. The outlook didn't offer anything new by ASEAN's standards, but as an articulation of autonomy, I think its ability to extract from the United States and other members of the Quad their acknowledgements of, again, ASEAN centrality in their respective Indo-Pacific visions, that to me is not insignificant. And not to be outdone, China did the same thing, not once, but twice. first in its response to the ASEAN Outlook itself, and then in a joint statement on the BRI and the ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity. Now, hedging, of course, has been dismissed by some as untenable should the US-China rivalry intensify to Thucydidean proportions, as proponents of the Thucydides trap idea have insisted. But my sense is that short of war erupting between the US and China, and maybe some would argue that that's not inconceivable, but at the same time, it's hard to envisage such a possibility. It seems to me that it is not unreasonable to assume that ASEAN will persist with hedging. Thirdly, and finally, I think it's probably worthwhile to look at how Singapore has responded to the US-China rivalry, seen from the vantage point of Singapore's role, if you will, as spokesperson for ASEAN. And here I refer specifically to the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong's appeal rendered in his 2020 essay in Foreign Affairs that both superpowers must work out a modus vivendi that will be competitive in some areas without allowing rivalry to poison cooperation in others. And I think few observers pick up on this, but I think it is crucially significant that it was during Lloyd Austin's stopover in Singapore, rather than in the Philippines or in Vietnam during his recent visit to Southeast Asia, where Secretary Austin pointedly referenced Prime Minister Lee's caveat that Southeast Asia must not be forced to choose sides. And Mr. Austin gave his assurance, as did in fact Vice President Harris in another forum, that the US at least will neither expect nor ask for such a choice to be made. And to make that statement in Singapore, as those US leaders did, although I would imagine Jakarta would have been also an appropriate venue, but in choosing Singapore particularly, I think the Biden administration clearly wanted to make this point in the ASEAN state that has been the most forthright and vocal concerning ASEAN's position on the US-China rivalry. So for Singapore, I think any new modus vivendi struck between the US and China must necessarily be based on mutual moderation and restraint, as well as some level of power sharing, perhaps, that would allow for the accommodation of China's aspirations within the current international system of rules and norms. And it is precisely, I think, this sort of a Goldilocks arrangement, imperfect, suboptimal to be sure, but so long as it is just right, that will grant ASEAN space to breathe and some respite from the relentless pressure that it has had to face. And granted that any just right arrangement will necessitate the mutual acceptance and participation by both superpowers in some type of power sharing arrangement, balance of power, if you will, to ensure a safer and stable environment than currently exists. But whether both sides are prepared to play ball in this fashion, that remains to be seen. I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew once lamented the proclivity of China's media to misconstrue his public comments on power balancing and to insinuate that he, Lee, was advocating, therefore, the containment of China. But on the other hand, Henry Kissinger himself once mused that the US also doesn't understand and cannot do balance of power well, so accustomed has it been always to setting the rules and calling the shots, whereas balancing is about the co-management of regional order. And so this implies that ASEAN perhaps might well be on a fool's errand if it thinks that it can persuade both superpowers to live and to let live. But I think how China and the US get their relations right, that will be key to ASEAN's future place and role in East Asia, and indeed even in the Indo-Pacific. So let me pause there and my thanks.
Thank you so much to the second panel. And if you are not in a rush, please stay on with me so that I'm not lonely as I try to conclude the 2 days of discussion. And obviously, I cannot conclude 2 whole days of very productive discussion in just 10 minutes. I just want to say that this time last year, we held our 35th ASEAN Roundtable. The theme then was COVID-19 crisis, its impact on ASEAN and the way forward. When I took a look at my concluding remarks last year, I realized this: not only has the COVID-19 crisis not gone away, it is now compounded by many more complex challenges and entrenched fault lines. So it is not without this consciousness that my team and I conceptualized this year's roundtable as ASEAN, fully garbed in crisis gear, braving these many storms. And we're cognizant that some of these issues remain for some time to come. So we plan for the roundtable to increase that depth of field by taking a long view of these challenges. If anyone has tried to take a photo of moving images, it is actually very, very difficult to focus. But I think through the panel discussions, we do now have an understanding just how bad these storms are and what we can do to shore up ASEAN's resilience. We started yesterday with Director and CEO Mr. Choi Ching-kwok, who observed how the pandemic complicated existing geopolitical challenges and put pressure on ASEAN's stability and cohesiveness. But he's also quick to assess that while these power rivalries are not likely to ease, ASEAN itself has not stopped moving and has coordinated an approach using the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and getting the RCEP into force, admitting the UK as a partner, and navigating the pitfalls in a potential CPTPP expanded partnership. Mr. Christian Eckler from CAS also called for ASEAN to strengthen its resilience and protect the especially vulnerable from the effects of these storms. And he reminded us that ASEAN continued to play a central role in the EU strategy to the region. Minister of State Alvin Tan from the Trade and Industry Ministry then asked for ASEAN's external partners to contribute to the peace of the region during these uncertain times. He identified 3 mega trends that ASEAN could leverage. First, the digitalization trend and the possibility of an ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement by 2025. And the second would be for ASEAN to enhance supply chain resilience by addressing non-tariff measures and expanding the ASEAN single window to external partners. And the third is to move towards a transition towards a green recovery, which includes the finalization of a framework for circular economy. Our first economic panel then examined the strategies that we can employ in promoting an inclusive and equitable recovery. The regional endemic normal outlook from the economists, from Dr. Chua Hak Bin of Maybank Kim Eng, had 2 possibilities. One was more pessimistic than the other. The more pessimistic scenario included higher public debt limits that can trigger tax increases, greater deglobalization trends, higher inflation, stricter border controls, and US-China rivalry, as well as new endemic normal disruptions. The more optimistic scenario included a release of pent-up demand, higher savings, a tech renaissance and digital boom that we can see, and an infrastructure that could strengthen connectivity and combat climate change. Dr. Sanchita, who is an associate fellow at ISIS, then discussed how the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and the paperless trade gained importance during COVID, but the implementation of paperless trade practices varied across the region. She then said that cooperation in supply chain connectivity and trade facilitation, as well as the digitization of documents, could be key towards greater regional connectivity. And she urged a broader understanding of sustainability and resilience in ASEAN. So you see here the word connectivity, which we talked about in this very last panel, has different connotations as well in the trade context. Mr. Sebastian Cortes Sanchez from the ASEAN Trade Center then focused the impact of COVID on MSMEs and how social distancing, border closures, dwindling sales have exacerbated. And he applauded ASEAN's efforts to date and looked forward to the eventual digital economy implementation. Now, this panel concurred that the faster reopening can see greater fatalities, but this was dependent on individual governments' tolerance levels for COVID caseloads, death numbers, and ICU bed capacities in hospitals. They also concluded that the observation was that ASEAN is now prepared or has accepted living with an endemic COVID situation. In our second panel, we looked at examining leveraging the crisis for a sustainable future. And speakers explored how the region can recover safer, better, greener through the use of circular economy and by exploring the future of work. In this panel, it was very interesting because at the end, there were questions that were raised where there were observations made that there was an increase in redundancy and duplication efforts worldwide, actually, due to countries desiring to onshore services because of this fear of supply chain disruptions, perhaps due to what we witnessed last year at the start of the COVID crisis. But they also speculated that this fear could be related to the rise in protectionism and nationalism sentiments worldwide, and even due to the geopolitical rivalry between US and China that is playing out. So you see, these bigger strategic implications and considerations do also play a part in how the private sector would behave in relating to its own business areas. And finally, we come to today. So clearly, we cannot have a roundtable without discussing ASEAN's most pressing problem, which is Myanmar. And along with that, discussions of the ASEAN Way, non-interference, centrality, unity, and cohesion. Sometimes it almost feels like, Groundhog Day when we talk about ASEAN, where some of these things we can't escape. I won't summarize all the points, but I want to drill down to the way forward for Myanmar. Dr. Vatikiotis highlighted two rather functional or legal issues for ASEAN to consider. First is the role of the ASEAN Secretary General, which is purposely or even conveniently kept weak by the ASEAN Charter. Perhaps it is now time for ASEAN to relook the power, role, and responsibility of the Secretary General. And the second is the need to equip the AHA Center to carry out more, to do more in its capacity. So the first issue requires political will from the ASEAN member states, for which we can't speak for. The second is actually quite simply a manpower resource issue that can be resolved easily, even at the CPR level. And then we come to the idea that, Myanmar is actually, the Myanmar issue is taking place against the context of ASEAN retaining centrality. This weaving of new alliances aimed at China has now created awkwardness and complicated the issue. Dr. Vatikiotis then left us with a rather innovative idea that perhaps ASEAN needs to appoint a special envoy onto itself. Actually, we had a similar discussion last year with this panel that had Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, another dollar to ISIS, William, Ambassador Seah and Bapak Marty Natalegawa. We talked about how we can raise individual ASEAN member states' willingness to exercise agency to protect regional interests instead of thinking all the time about hardcore sovereign interests. So it's a little bit of a coming around. But of course, at that time when we had the roundtable last year, we did not have a Myanmar problem. But I would say the two do connect. Min Zin then talked about the different approaches towards the Myanmar issue and the different reactions from ASEAN member states, how some are content with just hiding behind the ASEAN mechanism. We did go into a little bit on the role of Cambodia as the new ASEAN chair in resolving this crisis, Indonesia's efforts at engaging the Tatmadaw. And in case some of you missed it, my colleague Tamsak asked a question about the differences between the Thai and Myanmar coup in the chat. And there was then a little bit of that interaction between Kun Tamsak and Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, who then responded that Thailand, in the case of Thailand, there was a constitutional monarchy that allowed ASEAN to carry on as usual, despite that unconstitutional change in government. There are also high expectations we gather from that conversation in the panel. For Cambodia to do more, it is of course not clear if Cambodia will assume the role of the special envoy. It will now be very interesting to see how Cambodia steers that issue. And then now moving into the last panel, pardon me as I try to organize my notes here. I can always count on my colleague William on taking issue with the theme of the panel, and really he does ask quite an interesting question, which is really, does ASEAN have any standing in the regional order? And here, I think the discussion has been quite interesting in the idea that Alice has promoted, that we do need to rethink this value of ASEAN centrality in terms of connectivity. And here, you know, I put it back to the idea of connectivity. When we talk about connectivity in ASEAN, right, we often think about the master plan for connectivity, or we think about VRI connectivity, the connectivity in terms of infrastructure building. But here, Alice is talking about that connectivity in putting the dots together in the different agendas that's happening and unfolding in this region. She also says that there is now an opportunity for ASEAN to be more proactive as opposed to being defensive. And I do tend to agree with her, in as much as I am a believer in ASEAN. I don't want to be an apologist for ASEAN, so there's no need to be, you know, actually defensive about the institutional status quo. And then we move to See Seng, who also agrees that ASEAN needs to proactively engage in this agenda setting that's happening with the various mini-laterals that's happening, the Quad, the AUKUS, and so on. And we moved also to talk about Biden administration's policy, you know, that lukewarm signals we've been getting, and also talked about AUKUS as a commentary on ASEAN's limitations. And then following on, we also talked about the UK, and I love the imagery that we've been using, you know, the Goldilocks arrangement, how we can, you know, furrow and come down to a sort of a middle ground, and this relationships that's happening, that courtship between the US and China, and of course it being great to be courted. I think the lady in question also needs to think about what kinds of choices it's making. And while the US is not asking for some grandstanding big choice to be announced, I think we're all quite realistic that in many countries there are many little choices that are made in its, you know, in our daily lives. And little choices meaning which 5G network perhaps would you choose in your country as you move ahead with digitalization. That's also a choice. And then we also talked about the UK and its rebound from Brexit and coming to ASEAN. And of course, as we all know, you know, rebound relationships sometimes work, sometimes don't work. We have to see about that. So in conclusion, while ASEAN remain preoccupied, there are new geopolitical strategic developments happening that now threaten ASEAN unity, cohesion, and centrality, but with weak leadership and, you know, increasing polarity in the region. The chances of reinforcing ASEAN's relevance and its role now seems quite bleak for the time being, as we continue to be preoccupied with our own problems. And I want to loop around back to Dr. Vatikiotis' idea about needing a special envoy to itself. I think perhaps then ASEAN needs to think about not one special envoy, but perhaps, you know, a round robin of discussions about what centrality actually means to itself, because it must matter to itself before it matters to the people outside of ASEAN. So finally, special thanks to my fellow colleagues, Dr. Casey Lee, Sue Ann, Michael Montesano, and William, for your deft moderating skills. And special thanks to our speakers, especially those from time zone who have taken the time to join us in these discussions, and also to our active audience and to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Finally, please look out for our survey, which has been mentioned in the discussions at the end of October or the start of November. It'll be very interesting, of course, to see if the sentiments of a lukewarm Biden administration has been picked up by our respondents. And here's to a new endemic normal, and hopefully we can plan for a hybrid roundtable next year, and hopefully to be able to meet everyone in person. I won't say I want to ask you to stay safe because that's what we're supposed to do anyway. But do, keep in touch with us and send in your ideas and keep that conversation going. Although I really hope not in a groundhoggish way again, but to really keep that innovation and the creativity flowing. Thank you so much.